sufficient knowledge to get started to think about that topic. So the refuge or taking refuge is a mental attitude that is not unfamiliar. It's just taking refuge in the three jewels is something that might be unfamiliar. But taking refuge, one of my teachers, Lama Yeshe, said, we take refuge all the time in the objects of the senses in order to find happiness. We take refuge in them to get a sense of pleasure and enjoyment and choose which objects to seek happiness in and which to avoid in order to avoid experience suffering. So it's a very familiar attitude that we have. We all want to be happy. Nobody wants to suffer even a moment. So we look for the means of achieving that goal. And a traditional example that's given with respect to taking refuge in the three jewels is like a person who has an illness. They're going to seek a cure for that illness. So what would they do? They would find a doctor who has a good reputation of being able to um, address and cure the kind of illness that we have. We would rely on the medicine or the techniques that the doctor prescribes. And then we would rely upon nurses to help us understand and put take the medicine or put the techniques into practice appropriately. So like that, in taking refuge in the three jewels are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So the Buddha would be like the doctor who has a good reputation or is authoritative in knowing how to cure the problems that we have. His teachings are the Dharma, and that would be like the medicine that we take. And then relying upon a nurse as a helper is like the relying upon the Sangha, which is the spiritual community of practitioners who have been putting the Buddha's teachings into practice successfully and therefore can help us do the same. So the attitude of taking refuge is something that is familiar to us. Taking refuge in the three jewels, this is another thing. Like these three terms that I use, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, are Sanskrit terms. Buddha means to be the awakened one. The Dharma is the name for his teachings. It actually has lots of meaning, but here in this context, it means his teachings. And the Sangha means the spiritual community. So in order to take refuge, there's certain causes. There's two causes in particular for taking refuge. One of those is a healthy fear of the problems that you're facing. So just like a person who has an illness, they don't want the illness to get worse, could be life-threatening. It's not something that they would just decide to accept. They want to seek a cure. So that's the kind of attitude we're talking about here when I'm talking about a healthy fear. So it's very similar to doing a risk assessment. You know, like in business, you do a risk assessment to see what kind of risks might prevent you from achieving your objective. In business, of course, it's a business objective, but in our life, we also has objectives. And principally, the kind of objective that I'm talking about here is to be happy and to avoid suffering. Now, in taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, there are particular objectives that that we would need to have in mind, and like it's not just any kind of suffering, like like with illness. The best one to go to is a doctor. If you need money, go to the bank or a friend who has enough money to loan, right? If you need your back scratched, you don't need the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha to deal with that. So what we do need them for is going according to the teaching on the Four Noble Truths that I talked about last week, was to find a solution to um, the kind of sufferings that could happen after we pass away, where we could be reborn, or taking rebirth into out of the force of karma and ignorance, which result in which has a result which is dissatisfying because it doesn't correspond to one's reality due to the ignorance involved in where the source of the motivations of our actions would come from, and achieving the state of complete Buddhahood. So those are the kinds of things that one would take refuge in the three jewels in order to ensure that we have a happiness that avoids the problems that stand in the way regarding those issues. So these goals are stated very clearly in graded path to enlightenment texts, or in Tibetans called the Lam Rim. So Lam is path, Lam is path, Rim is stages of the path. And the stages of the path text, the first great Lam Rim text was written by the Buddhist master Atisha. And he was from 10th and 11th century. And he was a great master in India. He was one of the abbots of the large monastic university there called Vikramashila, which was modeled on the great monastic university of Nalanda. And there was a king of Western Tibet who wanted to revitalize the Buddhist teachings in his area, because there was a period in which there was a Buddhist, not a Buddhist, but a king of Tibet who persecuted the teachings. His name was Langdharma. So there was an interest to revitalize the teachings, and so he sent various people, including his son, to India to learn Sanskrit and identify great masters to invite to Tibet to teach the Dharma and revitalize it. So they chose Atisha. And so he agreed and got permission from the other hierarchs in the monastery to go to Tibet. Wasn't an easy trip in those days to go to Tibet, and also the environment was not easy for somebody who was born and raised in India. The high altitude and the like is not easy. So they agreed to let him go for a few years. And while he was there, he was requested to write a text that would help the Tibetans to practice the Dharma. So something that included all the teachings of the Buddha, was easy to put into practice, and did not consist of a lot of words. So that was his challenge. And he wrote this text called The Lamp of the Path. And in those days, Indian scholars who would dare to write a text, their own commentary to the Buddhist teachings. There was the tradition of handing it to an editorial board, which was part of their monastic university. And the editorial board would review it to see if there were any errors in it. And the errors included spelling errors, grammatical errors, and of course, errors in meaning or errors in referencing passages to some other texts like that. Also, even errors that of writing a text that didn't add any more meaning to what was already in existence. And in those days, the consequences of failing the editorial board's review was severe. One example that I read was that they would tie the text to the tail of a dog and walk the dog around the monastery, shouting out, "Oh, so and so thinks he's a great scholar who wrote a ridiculous blah 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 blah." So, not everybody was willing to write texts in those days. Whereas, of course, now a scholar who wants to get tenure at a university, they have to write something. But there's also editorial boards, but there's not, wasn't as severe as what I just described to you, and that's what I had learned. So he wrote this text and he sent it to Vikramachila monastery, and the higher ups there were very impressed by it. They said that had he not gone to Tibet, this text would have never been written because the scholastic community of Buddhist scholars in India would have never needed a text like that, there would have been never, so it would have never gotten written, but having been written, they found it extremely useful. And and that became the example of other Lamrim or stages of the path texts that had been written subsequently, especially in Tibet. The most extensive of which was written by Lama Tsongkhapa. But other masters of different traditions have also written Lamrim texts, like Gampopa, who is a disciple of Milarepa and one of the founders of Kagyu tradition. He also wrote a Lamrim style text, The Jewel Ornament of Liberation. So, and the main distinguishing feature of Lamrim text is that they're written from the perspective of three levels of motivation of a spiritual person. So there's the initial level spiritual person whose main concern is to not take a lower rebirth and to take a higher rebirth. So that's considered the initial motivation. So that's the goal of that person or objective, to avoid lower rebirths and take a higher rebirth. The intermediate level of spiritual motivation is a person who wants to avoid taking rebirth through the forces of karma and mental afflictions. Basically, the mental affliction of what's referred to as ignorance. And in this case, ignorance means, generally the term ignorance means an absence of knowledge. And even in Buddhist literature, there are times when the term ignorance refers exactly to that, the absence of knowledge, particularly the absence of knowledge about right and wrong, what actions are virtuous and cause a good karma, therefore higher rebirths, and what actions are negative and would cause lower rebirths. That's one type of ignorance. But the other type of ignorance is not just a mere absence of knowledge, but is actually a misknowledge, a misconception of how oneself and everything else exists. And that is the the main cause of taking rebirth in general, of having any of the mental afflictions such as attachment, anger, jealousy, self-importance, and so on, and yeah, causes one to take rebirth. So they want to achieve liberation from being from any kind of rebirth that is motivated through the force of ignorance and karma. Having understood that any such rebirth would always be dissatisfying, that no matter what kind of enjoyments one might have, ultimately one would feel dissatisfied with them, even if it's just for the reason that they're impermanent, they don't last. You know, like heaven would be great if it lasted forever. According to the Buddhist teachings, it doesn't last forever because its cause is conditioned by time, so its effect would be conditioned by time as well. And then even experiences that one would have that are quite enjoyable, one could get tired of them and have to then move to something else, eventually getting tired of that and moving on to something else. And eventually one sees the pattern and wonders why one should make an effort at all. But what's the alternative? So then you have to make an effort. And so there's a sense of dissatisfaction that even arises with respect to pleasant experiences. So trying to overcome any kind of rebirth that is forced through the causes of mental afflictions, particularly root ignorance and karma. And then the highest spiritual motivation is one to achieve complete enlightenment for the sake of all living beings. And so, you know, the obstacle there is not having the ability to lead any living being out of their misery and into perfect happiness. That's the obstacle. And so one tries to eliminate not only the causes of, you know, karma and the mental afflictions, which causes one to take, you know, this uncontrolled rebirth in a vicious circle of death and rebirth, but also to eliminate obstacles to knowledge. Because a fully enlightened being relies upon having full knowledge of what a person's capabilities are when they're ready and how to influence them, to engage in the kind of actions that will mature them and lead them to higher and higher states of experience like that. So having a healthy fear of taking lower rebirths, one would take refuge in Buddha Dharma Sangha to help one avoid those consequences of wrong actions, and to help one achieve a higher rebirth where one can, you know, have the resources for happiness. Or taking refuge in order to overcome the mental afflictions, particularly ignorance, which is misknowledge of reality, and the karma, which is the actions motivated by that, that produce the uncontrolled cycle of death and rebirth. And so achieve the state of liberation, which is the cessation of the mental afflictions and and the actions motivated by them. So yeah, cessation in the Mahayana tradition doesn't mean that the stream of consciousness ceases. That's not the meaning of cessation in the Mahayana tradition. The, the stream of consciousness continues, but it's free from mental afflictions, particularly ignorance that is a misknowledge of reality, and therefore actions motivated by such afflictions. That's what cessation means. And then for the person of the highest scope, they take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha in order to overcome these obstacles to knowledge, and so that they will be able to engage in enlightening activity for each and every living being without excluding even one. So that's one of the principal causes of taking refuge. So sometimes the word refuge might indicate, just finding a safe harbor while the storm is blowing, and so long as you get there, then you don't have to do anything. A harbor is smooth, the waves aren't going to sink your boat, etc., etc. But in the case of taking refuge in the Buddha Dharma Sangha, it involves taking some action. Just like the sick person has to actually take the medicine or engage in whatever the course of treatment is, they have to do something. And that's one of the reasons why taking refuge in the Three Jewels is considered to be an important practice. An important practice, because you have to do something. So, of course, a person in a hospital can be, surrounded by doctors, nurses, have a pharmacy with copious amounts of the medicine that you need. But if they're unwilling to take it, then, they don't get any cure. So similarly, there can be, one can be, well, similarly, we're born in a time where there was a Buddha, where he gave teachings, where there's a continuity of explanation of those teachings, and one has access to those teachings. One might even listen to them. One might even get a book and study them. But that doesn't mean that one is actually practicing them. There's a difference between, just having the knowledge about something and actually putting it into practice, which involves changing your mind. Like we have all kinds of thoughts that go through our minds. And some of those thoughts are embarrassing. And we're really glad that there's not a lot of people that can read our minds, because it's kind of, we're embarrassed by some of the thoughts that go in our mind. And those thoughts can pop up without any effort. Like there's some things that are difficult to access, and you have to have like a chain of kind of deductive reasoning to arrive at an understanding of whatever the idea was that one is trying to understand. And there's sometimes an idea can come into one's mind already just perfectly made, like instant coffee. It's just there automatically. One can even be surprised by that, or could even recognize, oh, you again, like that, because it's happened in the past. But then what do we do with those thoughts? Do we kind of continue to think about them even a little bit, or for a little bit longer? Or do we just recognize that that's not me, out you go, and give it no energy, and it eventually just subsides, goes back to wherever it came from? But That's a difference, that's a difference. Like, sometimes the thought can arise in your mind that what if somebody broke into my house at night and became a threat to me and my family? Maybe I should get a gun. Maybe that thought comes in the mind. One thinks, well, I wonder what kind of a gun, going on like that kind of thinking, Well, in if you're practicing, um, if if you're practicing non-harmfulness, not giving harm to any living being, then when such a thought comes in your mind, you'd have to you'd have to immediately stop it and say, hey, I don't want to harm anybody. I have to find a better solution. If I'm afraid somebody's going to break through my door, I'm going to get a better door, like that, rather than imagining oneself, shooting somebody like that. So that's the difference between, just being aware of these ideas of the Buddhist teachings and actually putting them into practice. Because when you put them into practice, you are practicing changing your mind, changing the way you think. And when you look at the practices, they're all good practices. They're loving kindness, compassion, generosity, moral discipline, um, uh, you know, effort, enthusiasm for practicing virtue, um, developing, uh, concentrating on virtuous thoughts to make them stronger so that your mind becomes habituated in them, or so familiar that those are the kinds of thoughts that arise eventually effortlessly. I mean, that's what motivation, not motivation, that's what meditation is for, is to take a virtuous idea and to so familiarize yourself with it through the power of concentration that it eventually just arises naturally in your mind. It doesn't take any more, you know, argument, with, because usually when we when we get some of these ideas from the Buddhist teachings, there can be some resistance, like, hey, having a gun might be a good idea. And then you have a debate with yourself about that, and from the Buddhist perspective, you would want to come up with the conclusion that that you don't want to harm anybody. So you have to find the methods that will reduce the harm with or reduce the dangers where you would feel compelled to. The only way you could deal with the danger is by somehow, um, by whatever means, harming the one who's causing the danger. Now, those are debates that you have in your mind, and that's what takes place in what they refer to as analytical meditation, which is, thinking about the idea and trying to come up with a good conclusion. And then there's the placement meditation, where once you arrive at the good conclusion, to use the force of concentration to familiarize yourself with it so much that it arises naturally within you, doesn't require any debate anymore. It just arises naturally within you. So so when one takes refuge, one is going to actually practice the teachings of the Buddha. When one takes refuge in the three jewels, and the Buddha Dharma Sangha, they're called jewels because jewels are valuable and they're rare. So the three jewels of refuge, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, are valuable particularly because of the teachings that the Buddha gave, and the help that the Sangha can provide, and they're rare. It's it's not that at all times there was a Buddha providing teachings wherever we were born. Like before Gautama Buddha, his teachings didn't exist on the planet. There was a Buddha before Gautama, but by the time Gautama appeared, those teachings had disappeared. And eventually, the Shakyamuni also, that's a synonym of, it's another name for Gautama Buddha. Shakyamuni's teachings will eventually disappear too. I think the Buddha said, when my texts or my teachings are just in the books and like in museums, and there's no experience, nobody's practicing those teachings, then at that time they will completely disappear. Whether they become invisible or whether the rats come in and eat the pages of the books, whatever it is, they will disappear. And so then the people that are born will have no access to those teachings, and especially, those his teachings on, particularly the teachings on the cessation of the mental afflictions, particularly the misknowledge of reality, and the actions that are motivated by those. Those teachings of the Buddha were unique. His teachings about what is virtuous and what is non-virtuous, like what's a good action that will result in happiness, what's a bad action that will result in suffering. Many different traditions have those teachings, at least some level of them. In the Buddha's case, he would, it might even be a little bit more extensive, like engaging in any kind of killing will result in a cause giving rise to suffering if that seed placed in the mind due to the action ripens. Whether it ripens or not, there's all kinds of conditions for that. For instance, it's possible to purify the negative karma that one has acquired. There's like any virtuous action that one does for the purpose of purifying the mind from some negative action that you did will purify that, and that action will lose its ability to produce an effect. Just like a seed that's been burnt, if you plant it in the ground, it won't produce a sprout. So like, for example, somebody who may have engaged in actions of killing, and they want to purify the negative karma of that, then they might engage in actions that save lives, and direct contradiction to taking life. So engage in an action of saving lives. Like one time I was I was living in Europe at the time in a monastery, and went to Nepal for some some kind of teachings that I wanted to attend. And during that time, I was bitten by two dogs within just a couple days of each other, and I had like never been bitten by a dog before, right? And so, and in Nepal, it bothered me a bit to be bitten by a dog because I was sure that they had not had any kind of, anti-rabies inoculations and so on. And at the same time, I didn't want to have to go through the standard procedure was like a big shot for every day for 14 days. I didn't want to have to do that if I didn't have to. And I had some confidence in Lama Zopa Rinpoche's ability to assess situations. So I went to him and asked him, do you think that I may have gotten rabies from those bites? And do you think that I should go to the hospital and start getting shots. And he made some observations and he said, no, you haven't got rabies. He said, but you do have an obstacle to your life. I said, oh, and he said, and I'll make a list of things that you can do to remove that obstacle. And there were things like going to one of the monasteries nearby and making offerings and have them recite the Heart Sutra, which is one of the perfection of wisdom, the teachings that the Buddha gave in very condensed form, and reciting it, I don't know, like 500 times or 1,000 times, and you can make an offering. And if you've got enough monks, then it's easy for them to do it 500 times because, if you have 100 monks, they can just do it 5 times and 500. So it's, not that difficult to do. But then there were some other things that I had to do, and like I had to save lives. And when I was telling my friends about that, they were like trying to think, well, maybe we should stand next to there was some steep drop-offs on the Kopan Hill, Kopan Monastery. When we see him coming, maybe we could just kind of pretend we're falling. Help, Pende, help. Like that. But saving lives. So I didn't know exactly what to do. So I knew that there was one street in Kathmandu where all the butchers were and where they slaughtered animals. And I thought, well, maybe I'll go there and maybe I'll save a goat or something like that. But by the time I got there, all the butchering had already been done. And so I didn't know what to do. So I went to one of the lamas at Kopan and asked him for advice. He says, oh, this is easy, he said. He said, go to Asantol, which is a kind of crossroads in a central Kathmandu, at sunset. And there you will find a woman selling little fish that the Nepalis buy to fry up, like smelt that I don't know, fishermen fry up and eat. And you can buy them and then set them free in a pond or a lake or something like that. So I went with a friend, and at sunset, wasn't completely dark. And so I saw her and she had a pail. And so I found out how many there were. And I think I must have bought, I don't know, 100 or 200 of them. They were very inexpensive. And she poured water in a big plastic bag and put a bunch of them in there. And then we had to go to some small pond and we took a taxi there. And by this time it was dark and we didn't know exactly how to access the shore of the pond because, houses. And so we ended up going through somebody's backyard and they called the police. And so a Nepali policeman came and asked us what we were doing. And we said, oh, we're liberating these fish. And he said, oh, okay. And he knew that was a practice, standard practice. And this is a kind of practice that's done by Buddhists, all over the world. They'll buy, small fish and liberate them, or little turtles and liberate them, like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he was taken to a restaurant one time, and it was a seafood restaurant, but there was a big case and the different lobsters that you could choose one from, and there was this huge lobster. It must have been at least 100 years old, this huge lobster. And so Lama Zopa bought it, but he said, don't cook it, just I'll take it alive. And then he went to the like Boston Harbor or something like that and set it free. So people do this in order to, purify the mind of any, negative karma of taking lives. And sometimes when you're doing meditation, uh, when your mind becomes more settled and become more free from the kind of superficial thoughts that go on, older memories can easily come to mind. So I remember doing one of my first retreats, and that just what I described was taking place. And I started to remember, all the ants that I had fried with a magnifying glass, things like that. I'm thinking, oh my goodness. And so, then you just, there's opponent powers that you apply, like regret and kind of a promise to do better in the future, and then taking, doing something positive uh, to compensate for that negativity. So it's possible to purify. So yeah, the Buddha provided all of these instructions for us to be able to address these issues and overcome the different obstacles to achieve the objectives of the spiritual practitioners of three scopes that I described. And but there are plenty of times where people are born and no such teachings exist. So there's no opportunity for them to achieve achieve cessation of that root ignorance and the actions motivated by it, and achieve the liberation from the vicious circle of death and rebirth. No opportunity to create the causes for that, and not even statues of the Buddha or texts that one could at least pay homage to and try to uh, acquire some uh, virtuous imprints in one's mind that might, gradually have over time produced, subtly, but better and better states of mind within one. No opportunity. So we're kind of fortunate that we do have this opportunity. So the three jewels of refuge are not only valuable, but they're rare. And so we're living at a time where we can access them. And so the Buddha, oh, and this is one point that I wanted to make. Because, oh yeah, the second main cause is confidence. Confidence that the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha will provide you with the means to achieve, the happiness of higher rebirths, the happiness of liberation from the cycle of uncontrolled death and rebirth, to the state of a Buddha who has no obstacles to knowledge to be able to benefit all living beings. Uh, One has to have confidence that 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 the three jewels can actually help. So to have confidence, you have to know what their qualities are, and so the action of taking refuge in the three jewels, uh, which involves putting into practice the teachings of the three jewels, is something that evolves within you as your knowledge of the qualities of the three jewels increases. So initially, that when I was thinking about talking about the qualities of the Buddha, and I was at a kind of stumbling block because one of the qualities of the Buddha is that the Buddha is inconceivable. So it's difficult to talk about the inconceivable, isn't it? So, so I was a bit, what am I going to say about about the Buddha's qualities? And there's numerous lists of qualities of the Buddha, the 18 unshared qualities, the 4 fearlessnesses, the 10 powers. There's like lots of lists of these things, that I've read all the lists, in my studies at one time I had them memorized. Not now. I didn't engage in the practice like one of my teachers who's a highest classification of Geshe in the Gelug tradition. Uh, you know, at least I don't know how many times a month, but he would spend, I don't know, a day or two, reciting everything that he had memorized so that he didn't forget it. So it was, and in the Tibetan tradition, memorization is, well, standard practice of their education system. Because at some point they had, I think during that time of persecution where a lot of the Buddhist texts were destroyed by that one king, they decided that it's better to memorize the information because then you have it with you than rely upon texts that you may not have access to. So they memorize a lot, like that. So that's what he would do. So yeah, so there are all these different lists. And then I thought, well, when and there are practices of taking refuge which you can do on your own. Just I rely on the Buddha's teachings, the spiritual community. I have an understanding of practice. Like I have a tendency to get angry under the certain circumstances. I don't like to be angry. I know all of the disadvantages of being angry. I'm going to apply the antidote to anger, which is loving kindness. So that's an act of taking refuge. And so I was thinking about, oh yeah, so that's an act of taking refuge. But there's also a there's a formal ceremony of taking refuge that you might do. I did with Geshe Nawan Darge, who was my first teacher at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, and a few of us in the class, which was an introduction to Buddhism, a 3-month class introducing Buddhism. We asked him if we could take refuge and if he could conduct the ceremony. So there is a ceremony, and you would do it with somebody who's a good representative of the three jewels of refuge. Somebody, Kishinau Darge, he was a monk, so that would be kind of representing the Sangha jewel. He was a great scholar, so kind of embodied the teachings of the Buddha, and he practiced it and aspired for the same qualities of Shakyamuni Buddha. So he kind of represented the Buddha like that. Easy for us to do because we had been taking teachings from him for a long time, had a lot of respect for him, and so we could easily see him as representing the three jewels of refuge. And then the ceremony didn't take very long, but we did. We did the ceremony, you recite certain words. I think you do 3 prostrations, uh, go down on the right knee, put your hands together, and you recite what he says. Of course, it was in Tibetan. We weren't exactly sure what we were saying, but there was a translator there. The translator told us what we were being asked to say, and so we did that. And then so we'd all taken refuge. And Kishinau and Doga says, "Okay, now you're all Buddhists." Like that. So that was kind of an interesting experience. But I thought, well, what was going on in my mind at the time when I agreed to my friend's idea to join him, his wife, and a couple other people to take refuge? And I thought, you know, and I thought maybe I just did it because they did it. That I wanted to make use of the opportunities that as much as I could, but I didn't really grasp the value of all the opportunities that were being provided, and I didn't even know there was a ceremony of taking refuge. And but my friends did somehow, and they were smarter than me. They knew a lot more than me. I stumbled into the the Tibetan community by almost by pure accident. So, and I just stayed with it because it was good for me. I needed something, and it was good for me. So, when one takes refuge at whatever level one is, but the level increases by the more knowledge you have of the qualities of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Yeah. Like for instance, a lot of the qualities of the Buddha we learn from the stories that have been handed down about the things that the Buddha did, like in even his former lifetimes. How he engaged in the practice of generosity when he was a bodhisattva, somebody aspiring to become a Buddha, like uh, giving his body to the tigress who was starving, so that she wouldn't eat her cubs because she was so desperate. And so he was just a boy, and gave his body to the tigress. And that was only one time that he gave his body to the tigress. But that particular time, um, the Buddha told that story when he was with his disciples in present day Nepal, kind of east of Kathmandu. And they stopped at one place, and while they were there was a kind of earth shaking, and by the shaking of the earth, this stupa, this kind of symbolic uh, construction, reliquary, uh, appeared. And his disciples asked him what that was, and he said that was, and then he told the story, and that his parents had they had gotten his bones, and they put him in this reliquary, and they paid homage to it because it was such. I mean, it almost killed his parents when his two brothers informed the parents of what had happened to their youngest brother. But they paid respect to him because of the act of compassion that it was about. But because of those stories, you learn about the kind of compassion that the Buddha had cultivated over, they say, three countless great eons. And you only start counting once he developed the bodhicitta, this spirit of enlightenment, this attitude that wishes to seek Buddhahood for the sake of all living beings, and not just an effortful generation of that thought, but through the practice of meditation, what arises naturally within you. That's when you start counting the three countless great eons. So, if one is like me, who can't think in terms of three countless great eons and wants to gain some realization in this lifetime, I know how hard it is to just go from, well, I don't even know how hard it is to make it effortless or just to arise naturally like that. So it's, through these stories, is that one starts to develop uh, some appreciation of who Shakyamuni Buddha was and what the attainment of Buddhahood um, means in terms of um, being an authority on cultivating or perfecting positive qualities, eliminating faults, and providing um, instruction to others on how to achieve the same attainment that he achieved. Like for instance, well, uh, I'll get to that example I'm thinking of in a moment. Another source of understanding the qualities of the Buddha is when the more understanding of the practices that the Buddha taught for us to engage in, which were the same practices that he did, uh, you develop an understanding of what it would be like if you had actually perfected that quality, like through the practice of meditation, single-pointedly gaining so much familiarity with that quality that you're meditating on, that it just becomes you. That's the way you are, such as equanimity. And equanimity is said to be the foundation practice for the mind training and eventually resulting in this spirit of enlightenment, this attitude to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all living beings. And equanimity is considered a foundation because that's, you have to start by developing an equal attitude towards all living beings. Because if you're attached to some, have aversion to others, then how are you going to have this attitude to work for the welfare of all living beings? You have to have all living beings. It can't exclude even one. And that's why even one sentient being is considered precious, like one of a resource for the spiritual path. Because if you exclude even one living being, there's no way that you can achieve Buddhahood. So equanimity is a way of developing an equal attitude towards all living beings, where you recognize that attachment to some occurs because when one meets that person, there's a pleasant feeling. They could have smiled at you, they could have said something nice, they could have helped you, or something like. There's a pleasant feeling, and thus one kind of gravitates towards them to continue getting those pleasant feelings. And of course, attachment is defined as not wanting to let go of the source of pleasant feelings like that. And whereas somebody that one has aversion to is somebody that when one comes into contact with them, there's an uncomfortable or painful feeling that arises. You know, they could have said something wrong. They might have, looked at you in disgust, or there might be something like that. And then one has this kind of aversion, little, even a little bit of anger, kind of a cold-heartedness towards that person, things like that, just because of that experience. Or a stranger, where one has neither a pleasant or an unpleasant experience of contacting, then one has an indifference towards and doesn't even consider them. And then there's a way of thinking that, well, once the attached friend was a stranger. So the stranger could become a friend. And and whereas the attached friend, if they disappointed me, if they treated me how I've in a way that I wasn't expecting, I might have anger towards them. So, and one can look at the example of the enemy, or the person you don't like, and thinking, well, if they were kind to me, if they kind of decided to accept me, I would like them. And so the enemy can change. I call it an enemy for the lack of, some other term. So these three different identities of the friend, enemy, and stranger, they don't exist as some permanent characteristic of the person. It's they're identities that we ascribe to them through our mind because of a relative experience that we have had towards them, which is changeable. And so, and so by recognizing, I mean, it becomes really profound when you start thinking in terms of lifetimes. Like there could be somebody that one dislikes right now, but countless lifetimes they've been your mother and have loved you so much. But because one doesn't remember that, and their form changed, and blah, 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 things change in the life, values change, circumstances change, who knows what impact we're going to have on just anybody that we bump into at any time in our life. Who knows? But that can cause somebody to have an attitude towards us, especially when they think of us as always going to have that impact because we inherently exist as a person who produces that effect on us. That inherent existence doesn't exist at all. It's a very changeable relative thing. Like some person, yeah, it's very relative what our sense of good and bad is, especially if our good and bad is based upon our current sense of feeling pleasure or pain, discomfort, like that. That's very relative, especially with ideas. You can get upset with ideas uh, by depending upon just a particular. Here we are, born in a country that has a democracy, and then you have different people running for office, and you can get upset with some ideas and like support other ideas, and it's just because you happen to be born in that particular society with that particular way of electing leaders like that. So it's relative, not absolute. And so by thinking in this way, and it's a rigorous thinking that one has to do. It's so not all meditations, like quietly watching one's breath. It can be a rigorous debate that one has, but the culmination of following the directions appropriately, one arrives at an attitude that they've all been my friend, enemy, and stranger countless times, and one's kind of feeling towards them becomes equal, equal. And so then on the basis of that, one can cultivate loving kindness because they just like oneself, wanting to be happy and to be free from suffering. And one can then cultivate compassion because then one wants the person that one feels love towards to not suffer, and one would want to do something to free them from suffering. And then one starts to cultivate an attitude that I'm I'm going to do something to help free them from suffering, and then one thinks I'm going to become a Buddha because a Buddha can actually do something. And right now, I'm very limited, but I can become a Buddha like that. So this is when when one thinks of all those practices that are being taught, and those are the practices that the Buddha engaged in, and with really powerful concentration. Uh, like in ancient India, not even in ancient India, and still in India, people are able to develop very powerful concentrations, states of concentration, and this was through the meditation tradition. This is something that, and in India, it's not only Buddhists who meditate. There's all kinds of yogis, sadhus like that who know the practice of meditation, dedicate their life to developing good concentration. There's some traditions where the ultimate goal is a deep state of concentration. For the Buddha, that wasn't sufficient, but for many, that's what they try to achieve is just a very powerful concentration, samadhi. And so, just thinking like that somebody could have perfected this, given enough time, and and being, having we can get enthusiastic about things, especially when you think about the benefits. Then there's a joy to engage in it. When you have that joy, you can persevere and continue and develop that. And anything you set your mind to, if you are real serious and can continue with the effort and continue to think about the advantages, and those advantages inspire you, if you have enough time, you can accomplish anything. So that's why there's one great Buddhist master by the name of Dharmakirti who he wrote a text on it was a commentary on another text that was called Valid Cognition. And so he was one of the Buddhist authorities on Buddhist logic and reasoning. And he wrote this text where he was talking about the potential to become a Buddha. And he said one of the criteria for us to realize our potential to become a Buddha is we have to have enough time. And he said, therefore, you have to develop some confidence that there is such a thing as future lives. Because for most of us, there's not enough time in one lifetime to perfect all of these qualities. It takes time. And that effort, if you have countless lifetimes to perfect these qualities, then perfection is possible. We often say nobody's perfect, but given enough time, given enough enthusiasm, using the right methods, yeah, you can become an example of perfect loving kindness, an example of perfect compassion towards others like that. It's possible. So even that, looking at the qualities or the methods that the Buddha taught us, what kind of qualities that those will cultivate, also help one to understand what the qualities of a Buddha are. And, things that the Buddha did, like his equanimity. He had a cousin by the name of Devadatta. I told the one story last week about when they were just boys, and Devadatta, who was considered a good archer, uh, shot a swan and then came down in the garden of Siddhartha. Then he pulled out the arrow and rescued the swan like that. So Devadatta, uh, he was used to being treated as a great lord, and so he joined the community of Buddhist disciples, but sometimes he would disagree with some of the rules of the community, and he was thinking, oh, we should do this, this, and this, and then like Buddha said, no, I don't think so. I think we'll just leave it as it is, and so Devadatta got very upset because he didn't feel like he should obey a rule that was determined by his cousin when he thought that his ideas were better. And his for a number of reasons his jealousy grew and grew and grew, maybe starting from the time when Siddhartha got to keep the swan instead of giving it to Devadatta, who had shot it down. And so Devadatta tried to kill Shakyamuni Buddha. So no matter how perfect Buddhists regard Shakyamuni Buddha, there were those who didn't think he was perfect. Like that. So imperfect that his cousin tried to kill him several times. And yeah, one time he tried to kill him by unloosening some mad elephant on the community, and the Buddhist disciples like spread out to get away from this elephant. The Shakyamuni didn't move, and as the elephant got closer, it started off charging, but as it got closer to Shakyamuni, it actually bowed down to him. And sometimes you see that I've seen photos of animals in front of Buddha statues that are kind of bowed down, or from some, yeah, it's just amazing to see that. So this elephant bowed down to the Buddha uh, like that. And I think one time Devadatta tried to poison the Buddha, and somehow Devadatta got the poison instead. And so he was suffering and even went into coma. And then Shakyamuni, then this, other disciples said, "Your cousin looks like he's dying from some poison. Can you help?" And so the Buddha went there and he placed his hand on Devadatta's forehead, and he said, "If it's true that I had the same loving regard for Devadatta as I do for my own son, Rahula, may he be cured." And Devadatta woke up from the coma and said, "Get your hands off me." That was Devadatta, but it's just there was a demonstration of Shakyamuni's equanimity to living beings. So there's these stories that you hear about, or his skill in teaching. So one of the qualities of the Buddha's mind is that they're able to know what our capabilities are, in any moment. Um, when we're open, ripe for some influence, and how to influence the person. And the Buddha said the best way for me to influence is by teaching. He said it's not as if um, ignorance is like a thorn that I can just pull out by my hand. Um, Anger is not like dirt that I can clean with water. He said, no, the best way for me to help beings is by teaching. And and so there was one time in India during Shakmuni's lifetime, there was this one person, Anglumala, something like that, was a name given to him by local people. And he was a person who was, he wanted to achieve liberation according, because it was not uncommon amongst different uh, teachers that existed at the time of the Buddha to have the idea of it would be great to become liberated from the cycle of uncontrolled death and rebirth. They had the term moksha, which is liberation, but they just had different ways of going about doing it compared to the Buddha. And so he wanted to achieve liberation, and he went to a teacher to find out a method. Unfortunately, he went to the wrong teacher. And that teacher told him that he should make uh, a mala, which is like a rosary of beads, uh, of human fingers, uh, and kill so many people, make a string of their fingers, and then make an offering to me, and I will set you free. And so Angulimala believed him. And so he became this serial killer. And the Buddha uh, was aware of him and saw that there was an opportunity to have a positive influence on him. So he went to the forest where he knew that Angulimala operated in, and when he went there, there was a there was an army that had been amassed by the leader, local leader, and the local leader Buddha asked him what's going on. The local leader said, "We're going to drive Angulimala out of this forest, and we're going to kill him and protect everybody around who can no longer go in the forest. They're terrified of Angulimala." And the Buddha said, "Well, could you give me a chance first to talk to Angulimala?" And this leader said, "It's not a good idea. He's killed so many people. He'll kill you. Not a good idea." And the Buddha said, "Don't worry, just give me a little time, and I think I can subdue Angulimala by myself." So he went into the forest, and meanwhile, Angulimala was thinking about this method that he had been taught. And it had been a while since anybody had ventured into the forest because they knew people who walked in didn't walk out. And he wondered if it was even possible to complete this task that his guru had assigned him. So he was having doubts about this method that he had been practicing. And then he saw the Buddha walking by, and he thought, my chance. He said, I just need to kill one more person, collect fingers to do this deed. And so he went running after the Buddha with his sword. And the Buddha was just strolling, as the story goes. He was just strolling, stopping to, smell the flowers like that. And Angulimala was running as fast as he could, but could never catch up to the Buddha. And then at a certain point, Angulimala was out of breath, and he said, how come I can't catch up to you? And then the Buddha said, because you're using the wrong method. And then explained to him that the method that he had been taught was not a method to achieve liberation. That method would in fact only cause suffering. It caused suffering to others, and by just the nature of effects being similar to the cause, they would cause suffering to you too. There's nothing at all positive that could be gained from that method. And Angulimala was open to the idea and said, please be my teacher. And then, so the Buddha walked out the forest with Angulimala behind him. The Buddha asked that leader if he could allow Angulimala to join his community and to continue to, yeah, and not be arrested, and then um, to continue to receive teachings. And the Buddha had gotten land from a local king to where the community could meet, and he made promises that his community would not be um, politicized, and that they would just engage in spiritual practice, and it was open to everybody. And so the king agreed and gave them that land and like that. So Angulimala went there, and it said that he achieved liberation, that he had, sometimes the worst sinners become the best saints. If you've ever read a quote like that. So he became liberated. I don't think that he died of old age, though. I think I read one time that out of vengeance, somebody's relative that he had murdered killed Angulimala, but at that time he'd already been achieved, this state of liberation. So he was beyond uncontrolled death and rebirth. But that was an example of the Buddha's skill of being able to teach. And there were many different examples, different stories about that. So the Buddha's, yeah, the Buddha's mind, um, his mind is, he has the achievement of cessation of suffering and the cause of suffering. And the cause of suffering, as I mentioned last week, it was the afflictions and actions motivated by the afflictions, karma. And also, he has eliminated the obstacles to knowledge. So the mere elimination, oh yeah. So anyway, so he's eliminated these things. So he has this quality of knowledge that's just an amazing quality. And one of the, remember I mentioned in the various lists of qualities, one of them was the four fearlessnesses. And one of his fearlessnesses was that he was fearless about claiming to know everything. Well, as I mentioned, at the time of the Buddha, there were other masters, teachers, founding their own traditions and the like. And so, and India had a long tradition of being open to different kinds of religions, and so they were very common. And they also had a tradition of um, of supporting yogis. So yogis didn't have to um, work at different jobs to support themselves. They could just go to villages and beg and get some food and then continue their practices. And so the Indian population was not shy about checking up on whether people's claims, yogis' claims, were true. And so one time, when the Buddha was on alms round, going around begging for food with his disciples, one householder said to him, I hear you claim to know everything. And the Buddha said, I have claimed that. And he said, well, how many leaves in this tree? And the Buddha gave a number. And this householder had his employees pick every leaf and count them. So they weren't shy about testing. Fortunately, it was the same number the Buddha picked. There was also a story of a group of farmers who came from some distance, and they had collected bags of I think it was rice. It could have been other different grains as well as rice, but bags, lots of them, from like the whole area where they were from, and they knew what what kind of grain was in each bag, and who the farmer was that had who produced that grain to put in the bag. And they asked the Buddha if he could identify who the farmer was, what kind of grain it was, without opening the bag. And the Buddha did that, and he was correct. He didn't make a single mistake. So he was fearless about stating these things that could be easily disproven. But when he was tested, it wasn't. And also the Sakyas, the Buddha was from the Sakya clan, and there was a whole bunch of them came in one occasion. They said, "We're all from the same clan, but we've never met, so we would like you to identify who we all are." And he identified them by name and so on. So those were just simple tests, but the eliminating obstacles to knowledge is for the purpose of being able to teach living beings, guide them appropriately to their needs, their capabilities, and their aspirations. Yeah. The another characteristic of the Buddha is it's said that the Buddha has uh, three holy bodies, and what I mean by body here is a collection, like a body of knowledge. Is three holy bodies. So the first one is called the truth body. It's a translation from the Sanskrit term Dharmakaya. Kaya is body, and in this case, Dharma is translated as truth. One time, in a different tradition, it means the, the the body or collection of Buddha qualities. So Dharma would be translated as qualities, but in this tradition, it's most often translated as truth. But what it's referring to is the Buddha's mind. But there's two characteristics of the Buddha's mind that it refers to. And one is the Buddha's natural purity. And the Buddha's natural purity means that the Buddha's mind is naturally pure of the obstacles to knowledge and the obstacles to liberation from this uncontrolled cycle of death and rebirth. And it's said that that natural purity also characterizes our minds. Our minds are naturally pure of these two different kinds of obstacles. And that natural purity is described as the potential for Buddhahood that exists in every living being. But that natural purity is the mere absence of a mode of existence that we imagine things to have, which they don't have. It's a fictitious mode of existence that we are in the habit of believing. And so the mere absence of that is considered the ultimate reality. And so the ultimate reality of our mind is the same thing as this natural purity. So the ultimate reality of our mind, which is a mere absence of this inherent or this inherent existence which we mistakenly ascribe to our mind, ourselves, to everything else, is this Buddha potential. And when all of these obstacles have actually been eliminated from our mind through the various practices that the Bodhisattva engaged in, until finally the most subtle of these obstacles have been abandoned forever, and a Buddhahood is achieved, then that emptiness of inherent existence of our mind is called the natural body of the Buddha, like that. Then the other is the wisdom truth body of the Buddha, and that wisdom truth body is his um, ability to know objects of knowledge and other mental characteristics such as great love, compassion, like that. So that's the Dharmakaya, or the truth body of the Buddha. Then the other two bodies are both form bodies. So there's some materiality involved in them. One is the known as the enjoyment body in Sanskrit, that's Sambhogakaya, and the other is the emanation body, or the Nirmanakaya. So the enjoyment body is the body of the Buddha that as soon as he achieves Buddhahood, his mind automatically, naturally emits this subtle form that takes a particular shape and which can be perceived by very high level uh, bodhisattva practitioners, and they receive teachings from that. It continuously engages in giving teachings and abides in the highest, what they call a pure land, the highest pure land, like the highest. If heaven has levels, it's in the highest level of the of what's referred to as the form realm. So continue having various characteristics referred to as the 32 major marks and the 80 minor signs indicative of realization, uh, constantly giving these universal vehicle teachings to an assembly of Arya Bodhisattvas um, until the last sentient being becomes enlightened. When we've asked, how long does that take for the last sentient being to become enlightened? And the response was, the Buddha didn't ever predict when that would occur, but they're in it for that long. That's that's what they're dedicated to, like that. And then, so those are kind of the, the, the mind and body of the Buddha. The emanation, that's Shakyamuni Buddha would be considered an emanation body. And his emanation body is a supreme emanation body because it's what founds the Buddhist teachings at a time when it was a dark age. There were no Buddhist teachings existing. Then the Buddha emanates as a founder of the teachings, gives teachings. Ordinary people can see the Buddha and receive those teachings. And the Buddha said that be able to emanate in all kinds of different ways, whatever it takes to inspire somebody to engage in in a virtuous action that will help their whole mental continuum to evolve towards the optimum state of realization. So, and when one takes refuge, one takes refuge in the Buddha, his teachings. The ultimate teaching is this cessation of these obstacles to liberation and Buddhahood, and the path leading to those cessations. And it exists in the mind of a Buddha. It exists in the mind, and there's countless Buddhas. And the potential for that also exists in one's own mind. So there's a way of taking refuge where you're taking refuge in those qualities that one is cultivating. And that is what, if one continues to cultivate them, one will achieve the ultimate results. So one takes an inner refuge, which is practicing these things to cultivate that, to actualize that potential. And then the Sangha is the community of practitioners, but it's referring to those who are Aryas, which means those who have actually got the direct experience of ultimate reality. there's different levels of that, from the path of seeing through the path of meditation before achieving the path of no more learning, which is Buddhahood. Different levels, but it the path of seeing begins with the initial direct experience of ultimate reality in a state of meditative absorption. So it's those are the ones that are the Arya Sangha are the ones that one takes refuge in, but a group of four or more ordinary, fully ordained monks or fully ordained nuns are the relative or the relative Sangha, spiritual community. Whereas the ultimate Sangha are those Aryas. And the Aryas they're an object of refuge whether they're ordained or not. So that's all the time that we have to talk about this subject. So, if in your study or practice the Buddha, if you have a meditation practice like that, if you begin it with the thought of, I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha, and I'm doing so by engaging in this practice, it helps. It helps a lot. It makes you closer to these jewels that are very valuable, very rare, makes very positive imprints in your minds, purifies the mind of negativities that have been accumulated, becomes the basis for taking vows and initiations. Um, Taking refuge at the time of death will protect you from taking lower rebirths. Taking refuge, engaging in this practice will ultimately enable you to achieve liberation from the vicious cycle of death and rebirth, and ultimately to become a Buddha. So it's now in your hands. So thank you for this opportunity. Appreciate it.